In 2001, Jim O'Neill, who was working for the investment firm called Goldman Sachs, developed the term BRIC, or BRIC countries, which referred to Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And in his research paper, Jim O'Neill discussed the advancement of BRIC countries through the first half of the 21st century. His thesis was that as the century progresses, Brazil, Russia, India, and China will become the economic engine of the world, and along with the United States, will dominate the global economy. This means that for the first time in modern history, it would no longer be Western Europe and Japan that would dominate the economy, and not even the United States, but rather a collection of formerly marginal countries, so-called third world countries, and formerly communist countries like Russia and China, that would dominate the global economy. And the projections were based on several factors. First, the population growth in these countries. Second, the ability of many of these countries to sell natural resources. And this looked particularly interesting as the cost of natural resources was projected to grow very rapidly during the first 2 or 3 decades of the 21st century. We now know that the cost would grind to a halt, the rise of the cost would grind to a halt, and in fact, the cost would begin to decline by 2014, the cost of gold, and then silver, and then, of course, oil, natural gas. But also, these countries, and this is just me talking beyond Jim O'Neill's thesis, all of these countries have long coastlines. If you have a long coastline, you're likely to have a lot of ports, and some warm water ports that do not freeze even in winter. And that means that you can become a major trading power, because most of international trade still takes place over sea lanes. So long coastlines were an important characteristic of all these BRIC countries, and also the United States. Many of these countries have nuclear weapons. The United States clearly does, but so does Russia, India, and China. But Brazil does not. So in this lecture, let me focus on Brazil and India, and then I'll have separate lectures on China and Russia. With regard to Brazil, the U.S. relation is friendly, but Brazil has been seen by some as a possible counterweight in the Western Hemisphere in the future. I have to say that these hopes that some people have had haven't materialized. Now, why would anyone hope for this? Well, that's because many countries in Latin America saw the United States as an aggressor, as an imperialist in the Western Hemisphere. And this opinion was not limited to the opinions of people in Latin America. This is also true of the opinion of some people inside the United States who believed that the power of the United States is excessive, and that it would be best if there was another major power in the hemisphere. So Brazil, for decades, had been hailed as a country of the future, but it never quite became one. One of the issues is that Brazil is unique in the Western Hemisphere. It's different from all of Latin America in that it's a Portuguese-speaking country. Brazil is so proud of its language, it built a Portuguese language museum. There are not many Portuguese-speaking countries left in the world. In addition to Brazil and Portugal, there are several countries in Africa, those that used to be Portuguese colonies. Portuguese, along with the Spanish were the earliest European colonizers. And so Portugal used to have an empire, but it doesn't anymore. And so there are not many countries that speak Portuguese. So the language barrier is one problem, though, or one point of division that separates Brazil really from the rest of Latin America. And also because Brazil is so big, it's 205 million people, and so rich in natural resources, it can afford to be its own world, so to speak. It does not have to maintain very close ties with its Latin American neighbors, although in recent years it tended, in fact, to have close ties. But traditionally, Argentina was Brazil's adversary, and both countries used to have a nuclear weapons program. Both countries have by now given up. In fact, as long ago as the 1990s, both Brazil and Argentina gave up their attempts to ever build nuclear weapons. So Brazil is different, and part of it, the recent optimism surrounding Brazil was the increase in middle class, but the middle class was increasing primarily because the cost of oil and other resources has gone up, but had gone up in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Things like gold, timber, gems, iron, tin, granite, uranium, platinum, all of these resources that Brazil does have, and many of which it sells abroad. For example, in 2006, Brazil became completely energy independent, and in 2007, vast new oil deposits were discovered in Brazil's territorial waters in the Atlantic Ocean. So Brazil began to sell a lot of oil, and as price of oil climbed upwards and upwards, Brazil was making more and more money. Creditors became optimistic about Brazil. Credit card companies came in. They began to give loans, in many cases questionable loans. It was not unusual for a business person to take out a credit card loan at 100% interest and then start a taxi cab company based on that loan of a 100% annual rate. So there was excessive optimism. And as oil prices collapsed after July of 2014, and as the cost of other resources has also fallen, Brazil lost a lot of revenue. And it turned out that much of its incipient middle class began to shrink. The poor, in some cases, have gotten poorer. So the years 2015, 2016 have been economically very difficult for Brazil. And on top of that, the political crisis that began in earnest in 2015 was the impeachment, though not removal, of President Dilma Rousseff. Compounded Brazil's problem. So Brazil is still mired in corruption, in very severe political problems, and in the very fact that its economy hasn't diversified too much. It does have some industry. Brazil is a very large producer of airplanes, one of the largest in the world. But beyond that, it still needed diversification beyond airline industry, beyond tourism and hospitality, and beyond natural resources, because it's a gigantic country of 205 million people. So Brazil, in fact, in 2015, 2016, has taken some steps back in terms of its economic development. And for this reason, it's weaker as a country. Its relation with the United States, it's good, but it's still different. It's a culturally different country, and it's a Latin American country. And the United States just has a very checkered history in Latin America in general. So while Brazil is kind of a friend, maybe it's not a great friend of the United States, particularly because Brazil's democracy is relatively new. It dates back only to the 1980s, stable democracy. Prior to that, there was military junta that was governing Brazil. So Brazil is trying to become a fully fledged developed economy, but so far it is still developing, and it is plagued by serious issues. India, in some respects, has greater issues, greater challenges than Brazil. India's relations with the United States are good. India is a friend. It has not always been a friend of the United States, particularly during the years of the Cold War, that is to say between 1946 and 1991, because India was relatively close to the Soviet Union. It was not in the Soviet sphere, it was not dominated by the Soviet Union, but it was relatively close to it politically. The United States and India were not really friends, and the United States preferred to deal with Pakistan and develop close relations with Pakistan. And Pakistan, of course, has been India's arch enemy since the independence of both countries in August of 1947. But after 1992, when India began pro-capitalist reforms, and after the relationship between the United States and Pakistan became more complicated and more tense, the United States began to gradually orient itself closer and closer toward India, also partly seeing India as a counterweight, not so much to Pakistan, as to China, because China and India are rivals. These are very big, very different countries with different history and culture, and these are countries that fought a war as recently as 1962 in the Himalayas, a war that India started, but that China finished very quickly. China won that war, and there's still a disputed section of the border between India and China in the Himalayas. So India and China are definitely rivals, and so for geopolitical reasons, it's profitable for the United States. It's beneficial for the United States to keep India as a friend in case it has to balance it against China. So India is a democracy, has been one since 1947. Its human capital is impressive. It's the second largest country by population, with more than 1.2 billion people. And I have to say that soon after 2030, India will become the most populous country on earth. It will surpass China by population. It's now kind of murky exactly when this will happen, because China has abolished its one-child policy, and so this threw some of the statistical predictions a little bit off. But there is no doubt that before 2040, India will become more populous than China. And English is one of the languages of government in India. All in all, there are 22 official languages in India. English is one of them, but only about 5 to 10% of the population are fluent in English. The coastline is very long, and India has nuclear weapons. So because of its vast human capital and its nuclear weapons, large coastline, India is an important country. And so in addition to English being the common language between India and the United States, India is also a former British colony, just like the United States. And both are multicultural democracies. India tries to respect the rights of minorities, just as the United States does. And so all these factors bring India and the United States together. This common British heritage, democracy, a commitment to multiculturalism. And of course, both India and the United States in recent decades have experienced significant incidents of terrorism, particularly from Islamic militant fundamentalists. And this is another point that brings these countries closer together. The need to fight radical Islamic terrorists. Problems, however, are legion. India is not really a modern first world country like the United States, at least not yet. And there are many reasons why. Much of India is still very rural and very impoverished. A very large percentage of Indians, approximately 50% of the population, doesn't have access to plumbing, to normal plumbing, so there's no regular toilet, and people go to the toilet just wherever they want. So India is also held back by the remnants of the caste system. The caste system, even though it had been legally abolished in 1947 when India became independent, it still persists informally, particularly in smaller towns and in rural areas. But even though it's informal, it's still very real, and this prevents people from taking jobs that are available doesn't allow them to take those jobs because if you're of a higher caste, if you were born into, say, Kshatriya, a warrior caste, you cannot take a job as a merchant, as a peddler of goods and services. You can't do that. So this throws the whole thing off. And some cities are overpopulated. This is a real problem. The infrastructure is not up to par. It's not a first world infrastructure. Corruption is very significant. Buildings often collapse because construction materials are poor. The builders steal the proper materials. The buildings are not maintained properly. Blackouts are recurring. Some blackouts leave millions or tens of millions of people without power for hours or for days at a time. So the problems are very serious. And of course, there are internal problems between various minorities and the Hindu majority. Approximately 70% of the population is Hindu, but there's also a very large Muslim population in India, and there have been mutual attacks of these two groups, the Muslims and the Hindus in India. The problems are many. Overall, I mentioned India has about 22 official languages, but overall at least 400 different languages are spoken, and there's over 1,000 different dialects. So India is truly multicultural and multi-religious. In addition to Hinduism and Islam, these two major religions in India, there are also many religious minorities whose numbers are far smaller, like Buddhists. There are maybe 3 million Buddhists left in India. There are Jains, there are Christians, there may be even some Jews still left in India. So it's a very multilingual, multi-religious, multicultural country. And it makes it tricky to govern when you have so many diverse interests, especially when the country is poor and when the country is trying to develop very rapidly but plagued by corruption. So India has many challenges, and it's a delicate situation and a complex situation, especially in light of the history. The Sikhs, I forgot the Sikhs, but Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated in the 1980s by her Sikh bodyguards, who resented that she sent Indian troops into the Golden Temple in the city of Amritsar to flush out the so-called terrorists. She called them terrorists of Sikh separatist Brindravali, who organized his group, and he was holed up with his fighters in the Golden Temple, which was Sikh's holiest shrine, and the Indian army stormed the Sikh holiest shrine, and the Sikhs were very upset about this. So there's a history of very delicate interfaith and intercultural relations in India. And I'll stop here. Thanks very much.